All right, and welcome back. I appreciate everyone being here. So we're going to continue the Hedera Regenerative Finance Forum. And this afternoon, we're going to be focusing on carbon markets, everything from what's being talked about in the Paris Agreement, Article 6, specifically 6.2, 6.4 throughout the day today. We have a fantastic set of panels, starting with this fireside chat with Mandy Rambaros from Verra, the largest carbon market standard, voluntary carbon market standard, and really a leader, especially on the nature-based solution side. As we go throughout the panels today, we're going to try to keep it effective. And as part of that, we're going to start with about 30, 40 minutes of questions here, but we're going to open up to the audience for 15, 20 questions, focused on how we're innovating. So the theme of today has been around bringing the balance sheet of the planet to the public ledger and looking at the 5 goals critically. Sustainable Impact Fund of the HBAR Foundation has laid out. Now, the Sustainable Impact Fund is focused on environmental integrity issues, thinking about how we bring the balance sheet together. So this morning was on greenhouse gas accounting, and now we're thinking about credible assets that are focused on environmental integrity initiatives. And as we think about that in the Hedera context, Hedera is a public ledger. It's governed by a consortium, our governing council of large companies, Google, Tata, IBM. We had DLA Piper here, Electricité de France, EDF, not to be confused with EDF, like the Environmental Defense Fund that Mandy used to work at. But this is a big group of companies across industries and geographies that have given an allocation of funding to the HBAR Foundation, who's chosen to focus on this area of sustainability, focus on environmental integrity because of the opportunity for public ledgers to help innovate in how we manage resources and assets on our planet. And so as we think about that, our 5 goals at the fund are making climate finance auditable, digitizing and open sourcing methodologies, a major theme of this afternoon, scaling validation and verification, discovering a global climate asset price based on the attributes of the asset, not just an asset's minimum common standards, as well as making ESG reporting credible, understanding those assets as they've been developed or as they're created over time, or liabilities in the case of carbon emissions, but not just that, water consumption, biodiversity, and other areas. So to start this conversation, Mandy, I'd ask that you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about Verra, the new CEO. Of course, with those changes comes new opportunities, new initiatives. I'd love for you to introduce this audience, Verra, and some of the things that you're thinking about in your first 3 months and what's to come over the next year.
So, can you hear me now? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Ves, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great venue, really good, to see a different part of Baku. So really happy to be here this afternoon to talk about Verra. I've been at Verra exactly 3 months now as the CEO. Previous to that, I was at EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, for a very short stint. I call it my rebound relationship, because prior to that, I was in an electricity utility in South Africa for over 20 years. So I worked in energy, the energy space, electricity space, and also in parallel negotiated carbon markets for the South African government and for the African continent for quite a number of years, co-chairing Article 6 towards the end of that. So very steeped in this world of carbon markets, both from a compliance perspective and a voluntary perspective. And so coming into Verra, it was the reason I took the job was I see the absolute importance of connecting the dots between energy transition, requiring decarbonization, and what carbon markets can do to enable that. So where we look at energy transition is needed most in the world, the countries of the world that need it, we need to look at what are the most sensible ways, highest integrity ways of getting climate financing to those areas. And carbon markets are a big part of that. So external facing, obviously a lot of that's got to do with stakeholder engagement, talking to countries and governments, having discussions around the how do we converge the compliance and voluntary markets? And I don't think it's about how and when and if, but we actually are doing that right now. And that's a big part of what we're doing as Verra as well. But also, and that's the stakeholder engagement part, the supply part, the demand part. But a huge part of driving that is how do we do our processes in a more efficient manner. And so a big part of my focus and prioritization going forward as well is the digitalization. Is how do we do digitalization of our processes, not just to be quicker, more efficient, but also to enhance integrity and transparency, which is very, very key. So that, there's a number of priorities, but digitalization is a big, big priority for us.
And as we think about digitalization, I think that's a really important topic. You have to assess different types of systems that are out there, what actually improves the process, gets projects issuing faster, makes verification easier, and we focus on the integrity issues and validation and project design. Can you talk about how you see digital MRV as part of enabling that process? What are some of the tools out there? I know Verra recently launched the Project Hub initiative and has made that a big focus. Can you talk about what are the steps that you're taking as an organization, and what are the tools that you see as important?
It's a great question because there's quite a number of aspects to that, a number of elements that we're working on in parallel. I wish I could go faster on some of them, but with some of them you have to work in sequence as well. So if you look at, for example, Project Hub, the project digitalization tool, project submission tool, let me use that as an example, which will speed up project submission, project registration. So as you may know, Verra is about 17 years old. So a lot of stuff when it started off was very manual, and it's still there, we're still transitioning. So the digitalization of the project submission tool is extremely important because what it does is that it cuts down that time that you take when you submit a project. So for example, we all know when you fill in a form and it immediately tells you when you are missing an element or you put in something incorrectly. One of the most annoying things is trying to put a zip code into any form you fill in the US. If you get the one digit wrong, it's like can't find the zip code. So it's a similar sort of thing, where you can fill in the form, it immediately tells you what you have incorrect, and then it does that accuracy check very quickly. So if you can imagine doing that by filling in a form versus somebody, you fill in a form, you email it to somebody, they check it, they come back and say, you've missed this column and that column, and that alone speeds up that process so quickly. So there's a number of elements, so that is one example. The other one is digitizing methodologies, as you're aware with. So there's a couple of things we have on the go and hoping to accelerate that in the next year.
Fantastic. And with digital tools, there's also challenges, right? So many folks who are here in Baku, they come from well-educated background. Maybe they're a negotiator. We just had a panel of lawyers, GHG accountants, and auditors. But not everyone in the carbon market comes from that background. Oftentimes, project developers work very closely with local communities. They have to think about how to build capacity and how we embed equity into that process. How do we give agency to those communities? Can you speak to how you're thinking about that from a Verra perspective and how Project Hub can help that? How does digitization of methodologies help folks who haven't yet participated in the carbon market? I know we have folks here in the room who are developing projects and they're trying to figure out how to get started, especially countries who have never managed a standard under 6.2. How do we enable those communities to bring their voice through in the projects that are coming through Verra?
So there's several aspects to that. One is the digitalization or the online application of registering your project, of interacting with Project Hub, for example, makes it more accessible. But the other part of that is, what if a community or what if the project developer does not have access? So a big part of what we do as Verra is making sure that we interact with the project developer. And I know that in the past we've had issues around Verra communication with project developers, and it's not been that great, so that's one of the big things we're changing as well. But what we want to do also is to ensure that we have that interaction with project developers to understand capacity building needs. And a capacity building is a big part of what we're doing going forward. So if you look at VCS version 5, the update to our VCS program, one of our requirements is digitization, but linked to that is capacity building needs. And do we have to take the project developer through that capacity building? But also, how is that project developer interacting with the community? What are the different community requirements that they are highlighting to us, and how we can help with that? But I think it's a role also for all of us in that ecosystem. When we talk about digitization, so Verra does program development, methodology development. We have these requirements on our methodologies that you meet sustainable development goals and all of that, so we have that in place. But can I turn the question back to you and say, how would the DLTs work with us to also enable that community involvement and engagement? Because I think it's important that we have different players going into that communities and doing that capacity building.
Sure. I don't know if I expected to fully get that table turned around, but I can tell you and point to some examples in the community, that we've seen, and I really want to applaud. There's some project developers like Alcott who are thinking about, well, I can go beyond digitization of a methodology for my own processes, so that I can easily submit to Verra or any other standard, especially if it's 6.2 and there's not a fully defined process in every single country that they operate in. But I can use that as a tool to get forward in consistency in my data, consistency in how I prepare information to submit. But in the same accounts, especially on public ledgers, that you can attest value. You can also, attest data, you can also receive value and start to correlate the project finance, the actual activity, and emissions reductions that are happening. And I think that opportunity is one of the ultimate unexplored routes for the global carbon market community, but also any other activity-based finance. Because if you have a series of projects in a portfolio of, say, a green bond or a carbon-linked bond, that you could start to trace not just monitoring and reporting the bonds, but the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the project together. You could correlate the dollars spent to the emissions reductions outcome, along with all the sustainable development goals reporting. You could have some really interesting financial products that are provable, publicly auditable, and I would say that's a big opportunity. But maybe I'll flip the question back and say, well, from Verra's perspective, how do you see the role of public ledgers, or specifically distributed ledger technology, changing your business? And what do you see as the exciting opportunity, maybe in relation to digitization of methodologies, from that kind of practical step forward?
So our methodology is already publicly available, as you know. So it's a public good. I've just come back from a panel this morning on CCS Plus, and Verra is developing a methodology for CCS. And we were talking about how important it is to have those kind of methodologies, or any methodology, as a public good. Because what is the ill we're trying to cure? We're all working towards emissions reductions and expanding and scaling the carbon market to get climate financing to the right places. So having these kinds of methodologies or whatever it is that we develop in the space as a public good is extremely important. So on our registry, for example, some of the data is already publicly available. But of course, there is some information that you would have to ask the customer. Can we publish your name or your data? And in some cases, the customers may say no. So where it is a public good, absolutely available to the public. But where we have to respect customers' confidentiality, we would do that.
And where do you see, from a distributed ledger technology, do you see how that can change Verra's business? Do you see an opportunity in the maybe 3, 6, 9 months where Verra could be using a public ledger? And where do you see that, if you do?
Absolutely. I think, we continuing these conversations on how do we collaborate in this space to increase transparency, to have more trust in the system, to have more partners that will increase that trust. So that absolutely is on the table. We've been talking to you guys, we've been talking to others around the whole digitization, the whole public ledger space, and what is it that we can and cannot do in the space, bearing in mind that it's almost like a quasi-regulatory space. So you have to be careful also in terms of what the regulations would require. What is it that can be made public, what can't be made public. But I think those are ongoing conversations that we're very keen to progress.
And And I want to pull from something that it was part of our comment back on the VCS version 5, but also some others that we've read about. And potentially we saw digitization referenced and Project Hub referenced. But would you ever see a world where those methodologies are publicly digitized and that digitization becomes a principle in VCS?
Yes, because that is all. If you look at the VCS Update 5, that is already something we trending towards. It's because we want the information, the data, the learnings to become public goods. Yeah, there's absolutely a space for that. Again, though, it depends on what can and cannot be made publicly available. So those, I think, are ongoing conversations around that.
If you look ahead as part of that, we follow down that path. We talked a little bit about the opportunity for financial transparency. And there are conversations like the one I referenced with Alcott where they're looking to say, well, could I trace the funds from a carbon forward? Maybe the aggregate amount I've earned from offsets, carbon credits sold in the spot market. To understand the total value created. But taking all the input costs that have been distributed to vendors in addition to the revenues made and show that I can say in kind, this much has been given to the community, maybe through education, healthcare, or other SDG-focused impacts, in addition to the hard currency that may need to be distributed to whether it's pay for costs or help incent different types of sustainable development. Do you see an opportunity where Verra plays a role in facilitating that in context of the methodology? Obviously, going beyond something like what SD Vista has done, which has been great. Do you see an opportunity for maybe that financial equity component for Verra to play a role in that?
It could be a role. I mean, one of the things that we're hearing over and over from buyers and from the demand, we ask the question, why did the market slump in the last couple of years? And one of the biggest problems has been trust, quality, integrity. And when you look back at that and you think, well, how do you increase trust in the market? I think traceability of data and transparency is a big part of that. So being able, so it's not about, I had a 5% benefit back to the community, trust me. So I always say trust but verify. So it's good to be able to go back and trace that and say, I can trace this back to exactly how much revenue went back into a community. We have these co-benefit requirements. We have this SDG requirements on the methodologies. I've heard the argument to say, but is it your job? Should you be telling companies, use my methodology, but I want to see an investment in the community? And I think for a large extent, that is our job when there isn't anybody else checking on that. So we want to be responsible. So here's, use our methodology. Our methodology helps you to calculate your accounting, does your accounting on emission reductions, and then, from a standard perspective, we have certain rules you have to meet. But I think because we're not solving only for decarbonization, you cannot find a single project that will be accepted if all it does is reduces emissions. We're also solving for energy poverty, food security, social impact, social upliftment, and biodiversity. And unless you look at how that, unless you can trace how you're meeting all of those things, I think you would struggle with integrity and trust in the market. So coming back to traceability of data and being able to look at that full value chain, I think is important for building quality, for building trust and integrity in the market.
And as you look at the value chain, there's a common phrase that we hear is, who said what when? Did it follow the methodology? What happens when the methodology changes? What happens, not just maybe the methodology changes, but the project decides that they want to access the government-to-government or G2G market under Article 6.2. Do you see an argument where who said what when actually adds value to the assets that are being created, to the carbon credits that are being created, where attributes become a subproduct of that credit, whether it's healthcare, education, or one of the SDGs? Do you see that raising the value more explicitly because we have better traceability to the data?
Yes, because again, like I say, we're not solving for one thing. And there's been a lot of criticism on in the market in the past. in terms of, are you giving companies a way out? Is it just an offset? But then if you have all of these other benefits that you can show and have evidence for it, then it would help with that trust in the market. And you know, we've often heard governments say that they prefer in the past, they prefer the compliance market because then you have to do social impact checks. You have to have co-benefits to the communities. And when you look at the VCS and we look at some of our requirements, we have the same requirements. So I think, which is why I was saying earlier, this convergence is happening. We just need to not question if there's a convergence, but to say, yes, there is a convergence. How do we make sure we optimize and not reinvent the wheel? Or if it looks at what government programs are doing now in 6.2 and 6.4, you know, and you cannot throw out the baby with the bathwater, so don't, you know, put the VCM aside, is bring these things together because it does allow for showing how all of these co-benefits as well.
I think that makes sense. And one of the topics that we often address is quantitative integrity. Is it more than a check mark? Is a co-benefit more than a check mark? But is that also a communication layer for the communities to say what do they value in the projects? Do you see an opportunity with digitalization to allow communities to better express when projects are sold, whether it's government to government or in the voluntary carbon market, not just to raise a price, but express a value? Does that give them more agency in the market?
I'll give you an example from my previous life when I worked in the electricity utility and we were working on the Just Energy Transition Partnership that we originated in South Africa. And talking to communities where we were going to shut down power plants, coal-fired power plants, and that's a hugely difficult thing to do. And I remember driving through one of the communities the one day and stopped to talk to some of the community members, and the one lady said to me that shutting down the coal plant is so important because it's going to help with the health of my child. So if you drive down there on a muggy day, you cannot see your hand in front of your face, and it's because of bad air quality. She said, though, but we also need our jobs, so we also need bread on the table. So the trade-off is, do I put bread on the table today, or do I have better health for my child so I don't have to be at the doctor all the time? So and they couldn't see at that point, they couldn't see the benefit of shutting down the plant, building a renewables plant, and having both benefits, job creation and air quality. And I'm simplifying it a little bit because it is far more complex than that. But if those communities are able to see the modeling work we did, the real data we used to say that if you shut down this plant and build renewables, not sequentially, you have to start building renewables way before you shut down the plant. These are how many jobs you create. This is the benefit, the revenue coming back into the community, besides cleaning up the air, which is non-quantifiable. But if we had that traceability of data through that whole process, it does give the communities more agency to say, actually, you're not investing as much as you said, or we're not going to have as many jobs, or the opposite. You know, we didn't realize that this is going to create so many more jobs. So I think having those requirements in our methodologies to say, what are the SDGs you're meeting, and can we trace that, is extremely important.
So jumping back into that digital layer on the methodologies, so it sounds like if you, and I'm just trying to summarize a little bit, if you digitize those methodologies with the SDGs baked in, you have all the questions, you have the answers, you could start to build a layer upwards to analytically see the net impact, not just in emissions reductions, but quantifiably say, we've improved healthcare this much, we've enabled this many jobs, this much income, maybe this much income where the income has risen across different gender gaps, across different areas. And I know some of the project developers in the room have looked at that even in some of the Verra projects today, well, saying maybe I can show that this employment was actually fair and equal, where in the past it may not have been or may not have been known. And so communicating the projects could in one way help meet a quality standard, whether it comes from Verra or something like the CCPs, or maybe it helps communicate to the market that this is actually a better project than you thought it was yesterday. Do you see it that way, or would you frame it differently?
That would be the ideal, you know, if we and if it's publicly available, so anybody can go into a project in Belize or wherever it might be and say, well, actually, you did create jobs or you did improve communities. I don't think it is that simple though, so we'd have to work through the complexities of that, because sometimes it's not about direct jobs, it might be indirect jobs or induced jobs. And working through all of that full value chain to understand that would be important. But the first step to understanding that is the data. And if the data is readily available, if it's transparent, if we have digitization across that value chain, then much be easier to do that. But the ideal is to be able to do that.
That's so, and to get to that, is it transparent? Can it be trusted? There's always the question of how do we validate, how do we verify, how do we build the capacity to do so, not just with the VVBs that exist today, but also the VVBs that may exist tomorrow, especially in the developing world. How do you think about improving VVB quality, and do you see an opportunity for these digital tools, public ledgers, to help better enable the process, better have a reputation that can improve or give credibility to those VVB assessments, those audits that come in to help issue a credit?
Absolutely. It's an ongoing problem. And if you connect all the dots, what we need is better price in the carbon market, higher prices, because we have such a marginal market that this revenue sharing with the project developer, with the community, and then paying the VVBs is not enough, right? So we need to increase that. But I also, and maybe this is not universally agreed, but I also think there's such a room for the big firms, PwC, EY, Deloitte, KPMG, you name them. Why aren't they training carbon auditors? We had it to some extent, I'm now giving away my age, when we did CDM projects, and we had designated operational entities, DOEs. Some of them were linked to the big five. But again, the margins were small, so it made the business case not great. What it did do, though, was we had DOEs in a lot of the global south countries. So these guys have reached globally and are able to reduce that transaction cost. So I think I agree we have to do training. When I say we, I'm using the royal we. I think it should be like ICVCM, should probably look at VVB training. But the longer term goal is, why don't we have the big five setting up auditing functions? Because they have global reach, because they already have an office in Kenya or Colombia, wherever it might be, and that will absolutely reduce transaction costs. And then, of course, those big firms already have digitalized methods of doing things. So I think that's an important way to go forward on that.
So, and as we think about that scale, of course, there's always, in validation and verification, the question of, I'll call it the chain reaction, where the community collects data with the project developer, the VVB, sometimes the same VVB in validation and verification, sometimes different, and then coming to the standard. Now, I understand the Project Hub is starting on registration, but do you see the opportunity for that same data that's originally collected to live on a public ledger for submission all the way through till the issuance cycle?
I think it adds to the integrity and trust, right? To see that we have that traceability of data through the system. So that is something that would be, that is part of the discussions for the future and what Project Hub will eventually look like and evolve to.
And if you could snap your fingers, and I'm going to open up to the audience in a couple minutes for questions, but if you could snap your fingers and say 12 months from now, as Verra, where do we want to be, and what outcomes do we want to have for our communities that work with us using these digital tools? Where would you see the digital tools, and what outcome would that community see?
Sure. I won't be like Thanos and snap my fingers and expect half the world to disappear, but I think what I would love to see is for Verra to be able to enable more project finance through our work in the communities that need it most. When we talk to project developers, when we talk to communities, it's, like I say, it's such a marginal business that a lot of them are talking about how do we get more financing in. And again, how do we get more financing is by growing the market, growing trust, growing integrity, and I want to see that happen. And so that's what I want to see, a thriving carbon market in 12 months.
Very good. So we're going to open up to the audience. I know that there's probably a few folks who want to ask questions, but if you could raise your hand, we'll come around, pass around a mic, and I see James in the back.
Thank you. I think the conversation has really been welcoming. I couldn't help myself. I sit at the Technical Forest Working Group with Verra, but some of the questions that we're trying to figure out, which maybe I might just want to bring back, is the market is consistently growing, and I think what a standardized market used to be called 3 years ago is not the same thing it is called in terms of the methodology thresholds. For instance, when you look at perhaps the follow sector, what you might be considering as quality data that was supporting reporting back in 3 years ago is perhaps not the same thing, and we're seeing market requiring more high resolution type of data for reporting, and that means there are cost implications that go with. How is Verra maybe trying to refine the new standardized way of reporting? Because there's been this whole questions about different frameworks coming on with standardization and what is premium carbon defined based off of the quality of data that is used to trace this, for instance. There is this whole complexity that I think most stakeholders are still very keen to understand how a leading carbon standard like Verra might be thinking about, how to confidently, bring this at a levelized ground to allow, further confidence in how do we position ourselves as developers or as governments who are thinking through the process on what to add into the national registry. So I think the question of standardization is really becoming complex because the methodologies are evolving again. So it would have been really interesting to understand what some of the next steps could look like for Verra with regards to that.
So do you mean standardization across methodologies or around data collection? What standardization are you talking about?
I believe it's mainly from methodologies, but really drilling down to the data aspects for reporting, which I think I really appreciate that Verra is on the right track on this, because before the data sets that were used for reporting, for instance, when you look at jurisdictional rate, there is more requirement on more fine resolution data sets to be deployed, which is a really great step. But again, there are cost implications that come with it. So how could we count on Verra to continuously guide us on how some of the standardizations can be met across markets?
So you're right about RED Plus, for example. What we're currently doing is data activity data collection, which costs a lot of money, and we've been investing. Verra itself has invested about $12.5 million in that already. And as we're going more to collect more activity data per country, it's going to cost us more. So we're on this fundraising drive as well to say, can we get some funding for that data because, because we want it to become part of the public good. The data collection per region, per country. And you would know, in different countries, we can't apply the data set we've collected in Indonesia to a country in Africa. The data collection has to be very specific per region. So we're doing that in order to be able to say what is the correct data to do your baseline calculation and things. So that is part of our vision going forward in that data collection. It will take some time though, because part of the problem is there's not enough capacity to collect that data on the ground. We want to use local capacity on the ground to collect the data. That's on the data side. On the methodology side, I've been talking to some of the other standards to talk about what is it that we can standardize across the standards, whether it's Verra plus Gold Standard plus ART plus ACR. What are those things that we can come together on, to collaborate on, to standardize across the ecosystem, so we're not confusing project developers and buyers? That is an ongoing conversation. I don't see each other as competitors. I think we're all pursuing the same purpose and the same vision on growing the carbon market, and what are the best ways to do that, and one of that is that collaboration as well. So these are ongoing conversations, and I now welcome any feedback that people on the ground, project developers that are doing this on a daily basis may have to say, have you thought of this or you thought of that, and this is what would work for project developers. So, in talking to project developers, we realized that some of our changes, we may need carve-outs, so we may need flexibility for different countries per region, because different elements may apply in different places. So, I'm just thinking of the example of physical tagging of trees, for example. It's not possible in some areas. And so what is it, how do we help that? How do we move that methodology forward?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Garilma and Georgina, and we met earlier at the cake, but so I'm representing the Mongolian government here. I work as an advisor to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which was very newly created in Mongolia, and it's led by a very experienced lady. And right now, our government is trying to structure and figure out the national strategy when it comes to the decarbonization. And Mongolia is very unique because we have a huge amount of land, but 80% of it is uninhabited, and one of the last nomadic cultures that's existing. And our land mass is highly degraded. 80% of it is now desert, turning into desert. So we want to reforest, also create more biogenerated good credits, like carbon credits. So pilots such, the ORDAS pilot is happening with about 1,000 hectares, replanting trees and all that. But obviously the standardization comes into it when we try to draw finance. And our president initiated 1 billion tree national movement. And they are also running around looking for money. And obviously, all the LPs, they're like, well, what's your standard? And we try to shop around and compare what is the interoperability. And obviously, coming from the tech side, we want to make it easier. And, you said public goods, for example, those communities that physically not available to be, digitally available somewhere, all the way in the different regions, hurting their livestock, or people who are living off of the agroforestries, and all these little impacts, and not just the finance parts. So I guess my question is, how can we make it much faster integrated into communities such as remote countries like Mongolia, and have them access to these not huge amount, but just big boost in their regular income already if they were to be registered with their local little projects, their forests, or renewed grasslands, etc. And is there a way that we can speed up, and instead of going the traditional way, can we just use perhaps with the Hedera or different chains? How can we digitize it so be more efficient? Yeah.
That's a complex question.
Sorry.
And no, it's a good question, because that's exactly the type of community we want to reach. And so when Wes was asking the question earlier about how do we involve communities, one of the questions is, does the community have access to online tools? Right. And is that the first step? And that's where I think relationships with governments and having discussions with governments on, this is what we can do as a standard. We've developed a methodology, we can help you with the accounting, with the standard process, but if there's further support that is required to get to that step of online platforms, then a partnership and collaboration working closely with the government and the community is extremely important. Because there's no point in us having these fancy digitized methodologies and project hub and submission tool if you don't have access. But I think I just want to be careful about about roles and responsibilities. So where does Verra's role stop? Where does it start? And a lot of what we do is, we do a lot of capacity building. So we've signed MOUs with about 27 governments now. And a lot of it is capacity building on how to use our methodologies, on what should their regulations and policies in their governments have in order to enable carbon markets. So that absolutely we can do. But digitalizing and having access to the platforms, I think, is a step further. And we need to think about who can fund that, how can we get that going, how do we work closely with governments to do that? Does foundations like Hedera have, is that what you do? I don't know. So putting us on the spot here. But I think that's a collaboration, I think that's very important in that whole ecosystem.
that's really glad. I'm very pleased to hear that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Amir Girgis. I'm from Egypt, a company called Carboni Bank. A couple of questions regarding the possibility of digitization and DLT with registries. One is, how do you see digitalization helping with the issuance of letters of authorization in the future, for example? That's an area. The other area is, a country like Egypt, we don't have forests. We don't. It's an arid land, and now with what's happening with the CCP and the ICVCM, is that renewables most likely are very hard to get financing under carbon credits. So, as a country like mine, our main decarbonization strategy is to decarbonize the energy. How do you see this from the angle of different, like similar countries that are having similar issues? My last point is verify VVBs. It's very expensive to verify projects, especially on small scale, unless you're having a big program where you involve different producers under that. How do you see the future for Verra in reducing the cost for verification?
On your first question, when we're talking about digitalization and getting data and analysis out there, this is also why it's important to have data, project data in a public platform that others can access. Because what it would do is, if you have this data available publicly, like say the energy transition data from Egypt, you would see how expensive renewables still are. So I always make the argument, coming from the coal industry where we were transitioning from coal to renewables, I always make the argument that if renewables were not additional and if renewables were cheap, why don't we see thousands of gigawatts of renewables around the world? So it's still expensive. And if you look at the financial data for a lot of developing countries, and especially least developed countries, the WACC is about 4 to 6 times higher than a Germany or a developed country in the north. So I think those calculations are incorrect, firstly. And I've said this to ICVCM, that when we look at the methodology, I understand that the additionality tool that was being used is not probably the best. So one of the things Verra is doing is a new additionality tool as well, to show that how do we actually do the calculation of additionality where renewables are still additional. And like I say, I firmly believe that. Even in coming from where I do, which is South Africa, where we did the Just Energy Transition Plan, we did the calculations on shutting down coal and building renewables. We were looking at shutting down 22 gigawatts of coal, which is a lot, and building renewables. We couldn't afford it. So even a mid-income, as so-called mid-income country, cannot afford it. So I think it is if you read the ICVCM decisions, it's not rejecting renewable methodologies completely. It's rejecting the way the additionality was calculated. And so those kind of tools need to be improved. And I think that I firmly believe that needs to be back on the table in funding renewables. But data, digitalization, all of that really helps that argument. It really gives us agency, as Wes was asking earlier, on how do we use these tools in our discussions, in our arguments. Right now, I think people are using a lot of experience from the past with CDM and things like that, which is not applicable anymore, in my view. Sorry, a second part of your question? I was rambling on, so I forgot.
So, VVBs, how can you reduce the cost of verification?
So this is why I was saying some of the big firms, the big five, should look at setting up verification arms like they did at some stage during the CDM. Because Verra doesn't do, we do have an auditing function, but it's after the VVB process. Our projects go to the VVBs for validation verification, so the cost comes from the VVB. Comes back to us for a check. To be honest, if we had a more efficient, more digitalized process around verification and validation, it would be cheaper, and we wouldn't have to recheck some of that. So it will speed it up and it will make it cheaper. So I think the question of how do we get better VVBs, how do we get more efficient VVBs, is one of the outcomes from our discussions as an ecosystem that I would really like to see. So not something we ourselves as Verra can do, but it's something, one of the discussions we've been pushing with other bodies like ICVCM as well.
Thank you.
Maybe just one thing on the access to that data. Could you talk about when you go to the registration for that project submission tool, do you see an opportunity for VVBs to get access to that same platform? And will that be faster for those projects to get to issuance?
I think so, because if you look at the amount of up and down discussions we have between project developers, Verra, the VVBs, and it's sometimes broken telephone. So I think it's important to have access to the same data so that we don't have, a lot of the delay comes in this up and down communication. But if we're all looking at the same digitalized data, we're all looking at the data at the same time, and you have, if you have teenagers, they play Roblox with their friends in other parts of the world. Why can't we do that? Why can't we have VVBs, project developers, all of us looking at the same data and dealing with that at the same time?
So if I hear you right, you say if you're looking at the same methodologies as a public good, you're looking at the same data, all the different parties in the value chain have the same access, then we should be able to get to an issuance much faster than we did before.
Just a disclaimer on that, though, is it's what parts of it the project developer wants to, or the customer wants to keep confidential, is something we also would have to think about.
So you're saying you would selectively disclose certain pieces of information for GDPR or confidential information, maybe related to energy assets or things of that nature?
I think so. And that's up to the project developer, the customer. It's not for Verra to decide. So, if the customer says, go ahead and put everything on the public platform, we would. But it's up to them also to disclose. But I think if it's a sort of a secure system, which, again, the platforms will enable us to do, where it is just that VVB assessing your project and they have access to the data, then it makes sense.
And so maybe we can go to another question in the audience, but I think what I'm hearing is there's this opportunity to speed up the process, and if digital can do that, maybe in a year from now, we'll be in a place where we're going to be able to get to that finance a little faster. All right, any more questions?
Yeah, hi. So I think one is just the feedback, I think, in terms of the process, right? So it's been, I'd say 9 months is what we're trying to get onto the Verra platform, and we're still not there yet. So I'm hoping, and every time we talk to the consultant, they'll say it'll be done by end of the month. So there's a lot of questions, and one that kind of delays a project developer because one is focused on doing the project. So I'm not sure if that's something that can be, again, I'm hoping with digital thing, it should speeden up. But today what we found, again, this is based out of India, you have very few consultants, and again, their communication also is not very clear, and they only do a certain part of just getting the KMLs, validating it and registering it. And then you have this whole PDD, which is a 60-page, this is not really a standard template. And then we are ending up, so again, quote unquote, is writing what we think should be there. Again, I'm just being very candid, right? So, and then whether we talk about SDG goals, and like now I'm doing an afforestation, and so I'm saying, okay, can I do this? Okay, it's goal 1, 2, SDG, and then you're trying to write that. And again, that is something be really good if it can get really validated and say, okay, this is what we've said, and that impact can be done. And I think the third question is, again, as he said, it is, even using consultants, it is very expensive. Again, for India, it is a lot of money that's being paid, and again, you're not very clear that whether it's going to get there or not. That's it.
So I think on the project submission tool that we've now implemented is to solve that problem, where you can submit your project via the tool, and then you get immediate feedback if there's inaccurate data or there's something wrong. And so that's it's something that we've just launched, a project submission tool, and then project tracker that tracks exactly where your project is, so that gives you that feedback. So hopefully as we are digitizing our process, we're going to see that coming out of the system faster and get you to issuance quicker. So that is, part of this digitalization journey we're on. And as we have said, what is your wish in 12 months is for us to be able to have that completely digitized so that you have that access very quickly and you get the feedback very quickly as well. And then, like I say, one of the takeaways from us for the session is around the VVB costs, and not something I think we can solve right here, right now, but absolutely something that we need to discuss and with others in this space on how we get that done better.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm back to you from Dovu. Obviously, Verra has a position on tokenization of retired credits. One thing we've been talking about today is the speed of issuance. Do you see there being a role for tokenization to enhance the liquidity of VCUs at all at any point in the future?
It's something we're discussing with various players in that space in terms of tokenization. But a lot of it, there's always a but. It depends. It depends on what the regulatory requirements are, and given the fact that we work across so many geographies and in so many, there's so many regulators that we would be subject to. It really depends a lot on that. I must say, though, what's very important in our world, the carbon market world, compared to, say, a financial registry or financial market, is our buyers care where those credits come from. So they want to be able to say, is my credit linked to a forestry project in Chile? Is it linked to a project in Ethiopia? So I think that part of that traceability is very important, and that's something to think about as we take these discussions forward on tokenization. It is something we're talking about, like I say, but I'm not going to make any promises in that regard for our future.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? So maybe we can turn to a couple of closing thoughts. And we've talked all the way about the benefits of digital, MRV, some of the steps we're taking, and how we potentially use these tools to get ahead. If you had to say one thing maybe to the stakeholders, especially the project developers, in the room, of if you were in their shoes, where would they get started? What are some of the opportunities that they could take advantage of today? And maybe a couple things a few months from now where you expect to be able to enable them throughout that value, kind of that life cycle of a project. Maybe we can, and any other thoughts on digital related to that?
Sure. How many of you use a fax machine? Nobody, right? Everything, if you lose this, your entire life is lost, right? Because we do everything on our phone. So I think when the voluntary carbon market started 17 years ago, everything was I think it's more than 17 years. So everything was very manual. And we're getting to, and we're seeing this evolution. So digitalization, getting to digitalize that whole process of project submission, review, and getting to validation and verification is inevitable, in my view. My desire is to know how we speed that up, whether it's through collaboration with platforms or others in the space, so that we get to that point quicker than what is currently going on. Because I think project developers want certainty. I use this analogy of, when you order a pizza, and you can't trace it on your phone. You can't see where this pizza is. It annoys you. But if you do, there's been a study done. If you are able to trace where your pizza is, if you can see exactly where the guy is on the route, you're actually less agitated, even if it is 20 minutes late. So I think digitalization removes that uncertainty. Where's your project on this journey? Is it at the review process? Is it at the VVB? What is the VVB doing with it? How fast? What can I estimate in terms of when I will get issuance? So digitalization is very important for removing that uncertainty of where my project is. but it also is very important for traceability and transparency of data, which inevitably will increase integrity and trust in this market. So I think that's very important. One of the other things we're doing at Verra is reorg, and I'm not just doing reorg just because I'm new there, but it's all in order to get more efficient and optimize how we work with project developers. So centralizing that, what do you call it, engagement with our customers, our clients, into a space where if you send us an email as a project developer saying, I'm thinking about registering this project, or can we have a discussion, somebody will reply to you immediately, even if it's to say, acknowledging your email, we're going to have a discussion. Let's talk about this project and what is the best route forward. I think so that's a change, implementing now in Verra as well, that we talk to project developers more. There's been this, there's obviously this, we have to be careful of conflict of interest, where we also review projects. So we don't want to get into a consultation process with a project developer and you're reviewing a project. So separating out those functions, I think, even for us internally, is very important. But being able to capture those discussions, have traceability around. We discussed this in January last year. This is what the outcome was. This is what where we've gotten to. You could have digitalization across that whole process, and I think it gives us more trust in Verra as an organization, and which in turn has more trust in the carbon market. And that's what we want to do, is grow trust so that we can scale the market.
So maybe we'll leave it there. The big takeaway is growing trust in the carbon market and using digitalization as a tool to do so. I want to ask for a big round of applause for Mandy coming to speak with us today. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic conversation.
Okay, thanks, Wade.